changes underlie behavior and changes to our thinking abilities. So today what I'm going to do is just talk to you a little bit about the brain. I do a lot of brain science, so I'm going to tell you kind of what kind of changes we see in the brain with aging, and how those are a little bit different from what we see in Alzheimer's disease, and then tell you about some of our research looking at risk factors for both healthy and pathological age. So as Dr. Bendlin mentioned, I have funding from the National Institute on Aging. Some of the work I'm going to show you today is also funded by the Alzheimer's Association, and I'll also show you some work from some of our other investigators at the Alzheimer's Center here in Madison. So just starting with the brain, I'm going to give you just a few facts. Oh, okay. It's too bad because my intro was just captivating. All right. We are studying the brain. I'm just going to give you a few facts about the brain. This organ, of course, underlies our very experience of being here today. It's composed of 86 billion nerve cells that are all hooked up together. And everything we remember about our experience here today is based on the connections between these brain cells. So there's trillions of connections. The brain, though, only weighs about 3 pounds. It's about 2% of our body weight, yet it uses a lot of energy. So we need a lot of gas to run this little motor. It requires about 20% of our body's oxygen, and between 20 to 25% of our body's sugar or glucose is used by the brain. Now, the way that energy gets to the brain is via a very complex vascular system. So shown here is an artist's rendering of the blood vessels in the brain. This is actually quite accurate. It's based on a cast, a plastic cast of the vessels in the brain. So you can see that there are some large vessels, and then there are some very, very tiny vessels. And these very tiny vessels feed the nutrients, the oxygen, the glucose to the brain. And they're so tiny that they literally only allow single blood cells to pass through them. They're that narrow. So there's a very complex system of vessels in the brain. Now, what happens to our brains as we get older? This is actually a nice, plump, young brain from a healthy person. Well, not healthy because clearly this came out of someone who has already died. But they were healthy when they died. And so as we age, one of the first things that happens is that the brain shrinks. We literally lose brain mass. So here's just a little chart showing kind of the progression of brain development from infancy, newborn to, you can see at 3 years of age, the brain is already approaching pretty close to what it's going to be in adulthood. There's these little tiny numbers at the bottom, maybe you can see the ages down there. But the highest bar is for individuals who are about 19 to 21 years of age. So, young people, don't squander it. It's a beautiful peak brain size right there. And then after that, the brain size goes down. Now the question is, why does the brain shrink as we age? And it used to be thought that a lot of this loss of brain size is due to loss of brain cells. And as recently as the 1980s, scientists believe that in certain parts of the brain, we might lose 50% of our brain cells in healthy aging. How many people think we lose 50% of our brain cells? How many people feel as though they've lost 50%? See some hands. Some hands staying up for a long time. aging. Some of those earlier studies came up with those conclusions partly because there might have been individuals in those samples that had conditions like Alzheimer's disease, and part of it was also how the brains were measured, the techniques that were used to look at loss of cells. And it turns out that in normal aging, we don't lose a lot of brain cells, but the brain does undergo some changes. So here I have some scans that were taken using an MRI machine, and on the top 3 slices, those are from a younger adult. She's in her 20s. And then the bottom 3 sections are from an older adult. This was a woman who was in her 80s, and she was cognitively healthy. She actually had excellent cognitive performance on her testing. But you can see that there are certainly changes. In these bottom 3 sections, these are sections kind of going through the head like this, and then the middle one's through the face, and then that last one is a picture like this. And you can see that there are fluid-filled areas that are larger. So, tiny little dot there. So this is called the ventricles. This is in our young adult, and then this is in our older adult. You can see that the fluid-filled area is larger. There's also more space around the brain. Contrast is not very good, but this is the cerebellum here at the base of your brain. It's important for coordination among other things. And you can see that it's smaller. So if we're not losing brain cells, why does the brain look smaller? The reason is because with aging, the brain shrinks. The cells themselves shrink. And also there's this substance called myelin. It's this white stuff here. It's a fatty substance that coats the nerve cells, and it helps signals in the brain travel more quickly. We lose a lot of this fatty substance in aging. And it's really a tragic irony that you lose the fat in your brain, but fat everywhere else is difficult to lose. It's like it drops from your brain to your hips. But when we lose this fatty substance, our cognitive function slows down. So you might notice as you get older, it's not necessarily that you are having that much difficulty thinking of things, but it might just take you a little bit longer to come up with names or problem solve. So this is one of the reasons. Now, Alzheimer's disease, as we know, is quite different from healthy aging. And this is a brain from an Alzheimer's patient. So I just showed you this brain of an older adult where you see that you lose some mass. In Alzheimer's disease, that change is much more significant. And it's because patients with Alzheimer's disease are actually losing brain cells. So the cells are dying. And that's quite distinct from what we see in healthy aging. Just to inform you a little bit about what we see under the microscope in Alzheimer's disease, what we see is these pathological features called plaques and tangles. You can only see them under the microscope. Now we have actually new brain imaging techniques. We are starting to be able to measure these things also in living human patients. This is to represent a healthy neuron, and then here we have the 2 types of pathology, neurofibrillary tangles, which occur inside brain cells, and then these things called amyloid plaques, which build up between the brain cells and are thought to be toxic and underlying some of that cell death. This is a picture actually of neurons that are connected to one another. In Alzheimer's disease, you lose these connections between the brain cells. And a part of the brain that's particularly affected is called the hippocampus. It's in the temporal lobes. It's very, very important for memory. And as that region shrinks and you lose connections to that structure, memories fade. And that's a classic symptom we see in Alzheimer's disease is memory dysfunction, severe memory dysfunction. And see, look at the NIA actually put this on their website, and they said this was a healthy brain too, even though we know better because it's outside the body. And this is a severe Alzheimer's disease, so you can see that there's a lot of loss of tissue. One other thing that we observe when we scan a person with Alzheimer's disease, we can put them in a machine called a PET scanner, and we can see which parts of the brain are using sugar or glucose. We see that in Alzheimer's disease, certain parts of the brain don't use as much glucose. And so that's represented on this picture here, where the areas in purple are parts of the brain in an Alzheimer's patient that aren't taking up glucose with this kind of scan that we do. Alzheimer's disease takes many years to accumulate. The actual pathology that's accumulating in the brain, plaques and tangles, take a very long time to develop. And what we're interested in from a research perspective is kind of up here. What we'd like to know, is there anything you can change here before people progress to dementia? How do we get people onto a healthy path of aging versus one that leads to dementia? So some of the factors that we look at include age, because age is the #1 risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. We look at some genetic factors. There's a gene called the apolipoprotein E4 gene that we know if individuals carry this particular genotype, that increases their risk for Alzheimer's disease. We know if you have a parent with Alzheimer's disease, that increases risk, maybe up to 6 times. And we also know that certain other types of factors like cardiovascular risk factors, blood pressure, cholesterol levels, blood glucose levels, that those also increase risk for Alzheimer's disease. And one area that we've been studying is something called insulin resistance. That's a feature of diabetes, and we're going to hear more about that today from one of our speakers. Insulin resistance is a condition in diabetes where your cells no longer respond to the hormone insulin and don't use the sugar that's present in your blood. And that's why in diabetes, your blood sugar levels go up. Some of the interesting work that's linked insulin resistance with Alzheimer's disease was actually carried out in animals, in rodents. There's a woman named Suzanne de la Monte who has done very interesting studies where she induces insulin resistance, or kind of a model of type 2 diabetes in rats, and she uses a drug called streptozotocin, and this chemically depletes the insulin in the animal. And what happens is that not only does the animal develop type 2 diabetes, they also develop features of Alzheimer's disease. So she's found that in these animals they show plaques, tangles, cell loss, and memory dysfunction. So this provided some pretty strong evidence in animals that insulin resistance could be linked with some of these pathological features of Alzheimer's disease. Now, I should let you know that midlife appears to be sort of a critical period. So if you develop cardiovascular risk factors in midlife, so things like obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, abnormal cholesterol, those things increase risk for Alzheimer's disease. If you develop those conditions after the age of 65, they no longer seem to confer risk. So we are quite interested in what is going on in midlife because, again, this is where we think we might be able to change trajectories. So in Wisconsin, we are doing some studies with participants they're volunteers that have given us an incredible amount of their time and blood and cerebral spinal fluid and brain images. These are just dedicated participants. And they come from a cohort called the Wisconsin Registry for Alzheimer's Prevention. And we have another cohort in Wisconsin from the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. And so we're studying people who are midlife, but also in older age as well. And we thought, why don't we look at what's going on in midlife? Can we see whether if you have cardiovascular risk factors at midlife, is that actually changing your brain and your memory function? And so what we did was, for our first study, we looked at a condition called metabolic syndrome. So it's a cluster of cardiovascular risk factors. Some people call it pre-diabetes, but it's not quite at that stage of type 2 diabetes. We also looked at people who had insulin resistance. And we did a number of different kinds of measures. We looked at a brain scan that lets us look at flow in those very, very tiny blood vessels that I described. We also look at this type of scan that lets us see if parts of the brain are shrinking. This here is actually a PET scan that lets us measure amyloid in the brain. So it used to be that you could only tell someone had amyloid at post-mortem when you dissected the brain. Now we actually have PET scans that allow us to measure that in living human patients. And areas that are red are parts of the brain where there are amyloid plaques. And we also use this brain scan that lets us look at glucose uptake. And we ask the question, can we measure these brain changes at midlife? So using the blood flow scan, we found that indeed, in middle-aged participants who had this condition called metabolic syndrome, and these parts of the brain that are shown here in this hot orange color, we saw 15% lower cerebral perfusion or cerebral blood flow in those parts of the brain. When we use this scan to look at volume changes, we found in this part of the brain here, that's important for memory in the temporal lobe, that with higher insulin resistance, we see a decline in volume. And we saw that both at one time point and when we followed people over 4 years, that those people who had insulin resistance showed faster decline in volume. When we used our brain scan to look at amyloid in the brain, we found again that in people who had higher insulin resistance, that they had more amyloid in the brain. And it wasn't at very, very high levels. It was actually, I should tell you, kind of a small, but what we call significant effect. So we think that in these early midlife stages that something like insulin resistance can contribute to brain pathology. And then finally, when we looked at glucose uptake, what we found was actually quite a strong effect over much of the brain, and that was that people who had higher insulin resistance, all of these dots are people, that with higher insulin resistance, we saw less sugar uptake in the brain. And this was quite an interesting finding to us because there is actually a theory about Alzheimer's disease that similar to what you see in the rest of the body in type 2 diabetes, where the hormone insulin can't deliver sugar to the cells, that may be a component of the Alzheimer's disease process as well, where due to insulin dysfunction, the cells are perhaps not getting the energy that they need. So what this told us is that likely glucose and insulin levels are important for the brain. These are, of course, just association studies. We don't see that these are cause and effect, but we know from a lot of evidence that glucose and insulin levels are important for the brain. So for individuals who have diabetes, don't be panicking. What we actually think this means is that certain drugs, for example, like metformin or other drugs that are prescribed for diabetes are quite important for maintaining healthy glucose and insulin levels. And there are currently trials underway which are testing whether diabetes drugs may show some benefits in Alzheimer's disease. We also think that these types of results may inform prevention. So are there ways through drugs or through lifestyle changes that we can maintain healthy levels of glucose and insulin? So kind of switching gears here to talk about, how can we reduce our risk? I just wanted to show you a little bit of the work that we are doing with collaborators who are studying kind of the obvious things that we think about when we think about glucose and insulin and preventing type 2 diabetes, including diet and exercise. This is my colleague, Martha Claire Morris. She's actually at Rush University in Chicago, but she's been working with us to look at participants here in Wisconsin. But I wanted to show you actually some very interesting findings she has from her participants at Rush. And she is looking at the effects of 2 diets. One of them is the DASH diet, the dietary approach to stop hypertension, and the other is the Mediterranean diet. These 2 types of diets have been identified as being healthy against various conditions. They're very similar in that they have an emphasis on fruits and vegetables, whole grains, relatively low meat consumption. In the Mediterranean diet, though, we get to add red wine, and in the DASH, you have to drink milk. So I don't know which one you pick, but that one was good. So for these 2 types of diets, what she wanted to know was, are they at all linked to the brain and cognitive function in aging? So she does this using questionnaires, but she has some way to validate these questionnaires to make sure that people are reporting relatively accurate reports of what they're eating. And she followed people over time. So one of the first questions was, how close are the diets of my participants to what we would consider the ideal DASH diet or the ideal Mediterranean diet? Remember, she didn't tell people what to eat. She's just seeing what do people eat. So for the DASH diet, not surprisingly, no one in the sample had perfect scores. She's looking at over 800 participants. The number of grain servings, and she's talking about whole grains, was exceptionally low, with only 1.3% achieving the target amount of 7 servings per day. Only 35% reported consuming 4 or more servings of vegetables per day, or less. Relatively few met limits for saturated fat or sweets, and that's because to meet the targets, it's 1 dessert per week, or less. I know. That's cruelty. I'm glad you feel the same way. But people did well in meat consumption, so many consumed 2 or fewer daily servings of meat. And people did quite well on salt as well. More than half reported consuming less than 2,400 milligrams of sodium per day. Okay, how about the Mediterranean diet? This is not Chicago, by the way. So on the Mediterranean diet, only 5.8% had a perfect score for the vegetable component. So that would be, if you want a perfect score, you'd have to eat more than 33 servings of veggies per week. Few met targets for potatoes, olive oil, or fish, but almost 50% met the optimal intakes of alcohol. So I don't know, I'm guessing here in Wisconsin you could do just as well. Now, what she did then was to see, okay, so people aren't doing, perfect diets here, but how about if we just separate people into thirds, and we say the top third are the people who are closest to the diet, the middle third, and the bottom third. And let's see what happens to cognitive function over time. And what she found was that for both the DASH diet and the Mediterranean diet, that if you were in this top third, this blue one here, is that over time, your cognitive decline was less. So these are the bottom two groups, and you can see they have a steeper cognitive decline. And so this is true both for the DASH diet and the Mediterranean diet, that if you can be in this top third, that is associated with less cognitive decline. Now you're probably thinking there's a lot of other factors that could come into play here. What they did was try to account for as many as possible. So they did things like have scores for how often are these people engaging in crossword puzzles and how often do they exercise and all kinds of lifestyle factors that you might think could play a role here. And using these measures, they were able to show that diet still had a significant effect. And for those of you that are sort of interested, Martha Claire Morris has actually published some research on something that she calls the MIND diet. It has components of both the Mediterranean and the DASH diet. I just wanted to briefly put this up here for you, but in the interest of time, maybe the best thing to do would be to go on Google, or you can talk to me afterwards. But these are what she's identified as the brain-healthy food groups and some unhealthy groups. So brain-healthy, not surprisingly, green leafy vegetables, other vegetables, nuts, berries, beans, whole grains, fish, poultry, olive oil, and wine. And then unhealthy groups, red meats, butter, margarine, cheese, pastries, and sweets, fried or fast food. Now I wanted to turn briefly now to the topic of exercise, which has actually been gaining a lot of traction and interest both in aging and in Alzheimer's disease, with the NIA now very interested in funding studies on exercise. I'm going to tell you a little bit about work that's been conducted by my colleague, Dr. Ozioma Okonkwo, who works at the Alzheimer's Center. And he has been looking at the relationships between fitness and the brain. So can we actually see relationships between level of fitness and brain? And so what Dr. Okonkwo has shown is virtually the opposite of our findings on insulin resistance. And that is with greater fitness, people show lower amyloid in the brain. They show higher hippocampal volume, higher volume of structures that are important for the brain, and also more glucose uptake, or more essentially brain using more sugar more actively in people who are more fit. So here in these plots, every dot is a person, and so you want to be in these, you want to be these dots here where people are fit. Now, these of course are association studies. There could be a lot of reasons maybe why we see these relationships. So Dr. Okonkwo is now starting exercise trials, because what he would like to see is if someone enrolls in an exercise program, can you measure the brain changes? Now, it's said that aerobic fitness, and a lot of it, is probably good for the brain. But the question is there some benefit to more modest physical activity? So thankfully, there seems to be evidence that things like walking are beneficial. And in this study, published in Neurology, what the investigators were looking at was the relationship between how much you walk and the size of the hippocampus. Remember, that's the part of the brain that's important for memory. And what they found was that in people who walked about 70 blocks per week, that was associated with the largest hippocampal size. So 70 blocks, that would be about 10 blocks a day, 5 to and from work or to the store. The good news is that if you walk more than 70 blocks, there was no extra benefit. So you just cap it at 70 and you're good to go. Now, another thing that's actually been of pretty strong interest is how much time we spend sitting, so sedentary time. And we know we live in a very sedentary society. And that, indeed, sedentary time has been shown to be really bad for you. So just standing up turns out to be good for you. Even if you just stand up, that can help normalize your glucose levels. It's also the case that light activity, so standing up and taking a short break and walking a couple of minutes, is actually better for you than just doing intense physical activity for 30 minutes in one bout. So this is good news and bad news. It's sort of, I guess, bad news if you're the type of person that just wants to do their 30 minutes at the gym. There's no question that's probably good for you, but you can get just as good results and or better results as far as insulin and glucose levels are concerned by just standing up and taking a short walk. And so this is actually especially important for people who have chronic pain or injuries who really can't get involved in a really intense physical activity program. Walking is just as beneficial. So I wanted to kind of just finish off with discussing one more topic, and this has to do with cognitive activity. And so you may have heard the saying, your brain is like a muscle. So if that were the case, I feel like if you work your brain too hard, you could have disturbing results. But it's an analogy, right? The brain is like a muscle. We have to work it. You've heard it, use it or lose it. So let's talk just a little bit about this area. So we know that there have been studies showing that there are relationships between, say, higher education and protection against cognitive decline and aging and protection against dementia. And it seems to be a dose effect where if you have higher education, then you have more protection. And the thinking is that the mechanism might be actually due to building up reserves, building up brain reserves, cognitive reserves, more connections that could potentially protect you against that pathology that develops in Alzheimer's disease. So even if you are someone who's destined to get Alzheimer's disease, if you have some of these reserves, you may develop the disease later. There's also studies showing that speaking 2 languages can also be protective against developing dementia, and that people who develop or who speak 2 languages may have as much of a delay as 4 years before showing signs of Alzheimer's disease. So for those college graduates who speak more than 1 language, right now you're saying, I've got it made in the shade, right? But what about for people who perhaps didn't finish school or didn't have parents who insisted that they speak another language? Could you start some kind of program later in life that would confer similar benefits? So there is kind of limited studies in this area, but it is an area that people are very interested in. And it seems to me that when I give these talks, individuals often ask me, should I sign up for Lumosity? Is that going to be beneficial? So I thought I would just show you the results of a couple of studies in this area. One is from an interesting scientist at the University of California, San Francisco, Adam Gazzaley. And he studies the brain changes in aging and cognitive changes in aging. And he had a study published in Nature on his results with a cognitive training game. And it was called NeuroRacer. And he essentially invited individuals who were 60 to 85 years of age to come into the lab and learn this game, which essentially involved divided attention. So participants had to go on track not in virtual reality. You're driving along the track and then you pay attention to different signage on the road. And he sent this game home with his participants, and they did approximately 12 hours of training. And then he brought them back into the laboratory, and he looked both at their performance and at brain changes. And what he found was that older adults who did the training on the game got better. In fact, they got so good that they did better than young people coming in and doing the game for the first time. He also found that people who engaged in this game did better on laboratory tests of attention. So it seemed to transfer from the game to other tests of attention and reasoning. So of course he started a company, and he's probably going to get really rich selling this game. Actually, that's not the case. He's doing this for the science part of it. The problem is with these types of games, we don't know if they translate into your activities of daily life. So is it the case that, in your day-to-day activities, this type of training would be beneficial? There is another study that was funded by the National Institute on Aging that looked at cognitive function and whether training could be beneficial. So in this study, they found that after several months actually in this one, 5 to 6 weeks of cognitive training, that they could again show some benefits in the laboratory. After 2 years, this did not translate to benefits outside of the laboratory. But when they followed up participants 5 to 10 years later, they found that those that had engaged in the cognitive training actually maintained those benefits 5 to 10 years later, and that at that time point, it did translate into improved activities of daily living. Just a little bit of data from, again, from Dr. Ozio-Macamplo. He's shown that you don't necessarily have to buy a computer game and perhaps do boring computer training at home, but that playing activities such as cards, checkers, crosswords, or puzzles are also associated with brain changes, again, hippocampal volume, and improved memory function in the laboratory. This, of course, could involve a social component. We know that being with other people is very important as we age. So I wanted to just end with one very small but fascinating study that was conducted by my mentor at the University of Arizona. And what she found was that if you have older adults sign up for a Facebook account, which involves both learning something new and a social component, that was associated with better memory function. So although the study was quite small, it does seem to suggest that learning something new and having a social component can be beneficial for cognitive function. So I will wrap it up there. We talked about a number of factors that are what we call non-modifiable, that we can't change: age, genetics, family history, environmental factors outside of our control, but we do think that there are possibly modifiable factors, including blood sugar levels, exercise, and being cognitively engaged. And we're going to hear about a number of other factors today. One of my favorites, which we didn't talk about, was the effect of music in healthy aging. And I had the privilege of going to see the world's greatest rock band in Milwaukee, and saw this man on stage who is really, despite all his hard living, I think aging really well. You probably heard people say, oh, they shouldn't play at that age, and what are they doing? But they are having so much fun, and they're winning at life. And just to underscore kind of our expectations about how long these gentlemen are likely to live, somebody sent me this. It says, the caption says, start worrying about what kind of world, not we're going to leave for our children,